Let me cut right through the mainstream media noise regarding the recent collapse of the U.S. naval blockade on Iran. If you are watching the chaos unfold in the Strait of Hormuz and waiting for a military showdown, you are obsessing over the wrong nightmare entirely. Most pundits are on television hyperventilating, asking if Beijing is about to step in and unleash its military might. That is the panicked, obsolete question of an analyst still trapped in a 20th century mindset. Someone who mistakenly equates the projection of global power exclusively with boots on the ground and billion-dollar aircraft carriers. The only question that actually matters, the one that will define the geopolitical landscape, is this. At what exact second did Washington's economic blockade cross the line into a direct, unforgivable assault on China's sovereign right to trade? Once you look at the board through that specific lens, the terrifying reality of the last 6 weeks snaps into incredibly sharp, uncomfortable focus. Washington committed a catastrophic unforced error because it assumed that a lack of Chinese missiles flying through the air meant a guarantee of Chinese compliance. I can tell you right now, this delusional arrogance is the single most toxic and dangerous ideology currently circulating inside the Beltway. History relentlessly destroys empires that confuse a geopolitical rival's strategic patience with outright submission. Let's rewind the tape and look at the facts. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel executed coordinated massive strikes against Iranian targets, assassinating Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and hammering the nation's nuclear infrastructure. Cornered and bleeding, Tehran fired back using the only massive structural weapon it possessed. They slammed the Strait of Hormuz completely shut. We are talking about a geographical bottleneck that is just 21 miles wide at its tightest point. Yet a staggering 20% of global petroleum and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas are forced to flow right through that tiny opening. When Iran shut the door, the disruption didn't just rattle the global economy. It induced an immediate massive economic cardiac arrest. Spiking oil prices shattered already fragile supply chains. The European Commission came out and labeled the closure greatly damaging, while the UK declared it deeply damaging. Listen to me, those aren't geopolitical battle lines being drawn by loyal allies. Those are the desperate, gasping words of major economies feeling their vital arteries choke off. Here is the fatal miscalculation made by the strategists in the Pentagon. They operated on the arrogant assumption that Iran would suffer the most from this closure. They were dead wrong. The entity facing the absolute greatest structural long-term threat from a closed strait was the People's Republic of China. Beijing isn't just some casual customer out there. It stands as the absolute largest buyer of Iranian crude oil on the planet. What's more, according to shipping data from Lloyd's List, the transactions for this oil weren't happening in American greenbacks. They were already being seamlessly settled in Chinese yuan. I need you to chew on that detail for a second. The petrodollar, the very bedrock of American financial supremacy, wasn't just facing a theoretical academic challenge. It was being actively, practically bypassed and dismantled at the exact moment Washington decided to turn up the heat and escalate. I always look to game theory in these flashpoints because it never lies. When you back a rational actor into a corner where obedient surrender costs them more than outright resistance, you are never going to get obedience. You get a calculated, lethal resistance, cloaked in diplomatic niceties but executed with ruthless strategic clarity. Beijing didn't need to launch a single hypersonic weapon to break the United States. They just needed to sail a boat, enter the rich Starry, a Chinese-owned tanker that brazenly shattered the American blockade. But it didn't just blast through. First, it performed a highly choreographed maneuver, appearing to turn back in the strait before punching right through the line. Make no mistake, that wasn't a navigational error by a confused captain. That was pure maritime theater. A thunderous message delivered not in a diplomat's briefcase, but through raw physical momentum. The vessel itself is owned by the Shanghai Shuanren Shipping Company, an entity the U.S. had already slapped with heavy sanctions. This means Beijing deliberately authorized this run with complete, crystal-clear knowledge of the legal ramifications, pushing straight through a line heavily enforced by the most powerful navy in human history. It wasn't a reckless gamble. It was a lethal, meticulously measured signal that completely blindsided Washington. We have to zoom out to see the real architecture of this crisis. We are not looking at a localized petty squabble over Persian Gulf crude exports. I am telling you, this is the first ultimate stress test of whether America can still force a 21st century peer competitor into complete economic submission. Look at the historical record. Previous U.S. blockades targeted the likes of North Korea, Cuba, Iraq, and Venezuela. Those states were weak. They lacked the geopolitical gravity to fight back, and absolutely no superpower was willing to bleed to defend them. Iran is a completely different beast. Iran sits entirely unisolated at the center of a massive non-Western web, deeply entangled with Russia, China, and the broader global south, making total isolation a structural impossibility. Consider Beijing's public posture leading up to this. Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang demanded a full ceasefire, publicly condemning the U.S. blockade as a dangerous and irresponsible act that would only severely inflame regional tension. To the untrained ear, that sounds like standard, boring diplomatic whining. But in high-level geopolitics, calling something dangerous and irresponsible isn't just showing disapproval, it is serving a formal eviction notice. It was Beijing drawing a massive red line using polite bureaucratic ink right before they crossed that exact line with thousands of tons of steel, and they certainly did cross it. By April 20th, a staggering 26 ships had successfully pierced the American blockade line, moving in both directions. Think about the sheer strategic humiliation here. You have a massive U.S. blockade backed by a dozen warships, dozens of aircraft, and over 10,000 military personnel. Yet it was completely unraveling, not under a barrage of Iranian torpedoes, but because desperate nations simply could not afford the economic suicide of obeying Washington's commercial logic. This is the classic, entirely predictable trap of imperial overreach. Washington has backed itself onto a cliff. Enforcing this blockade means forcefully intercepting Chinese commercial vessels, which guarantees a direct catastrophic collision with Chinese economic sovereignty, and by extensions, a potential kinetic war with a nuclear-armed peer while already deeply bogged down with Iran. But doing nothing. That means sitting on your hands while the blockade crumbles, ship by ship, tanker by tanker, transforming a tool of supreme global pressure into a rolling showcase of American humiliation. What makes this exponentially worse is the initial arrogance. China was never consulted or even warned before the U.S. initiated military operations against Iran. To Washington's planners, skipping the heads-up might have felt like a minor diplomatic slight. To Beijing, it was experienced as a glaring declaration of hostile intent. When you blindside the world's second-largest economy, an economy you are intrinsically linked to, with a war that instantly chokes off 20% of global oil trade, you aren't just being rude, you are screaming your worldview out loud. That China's vital interests are just trivial obstacles for America to manage, not sovereign rights to be negotiated. Beijing heard that message with crystal clear clarity. History gives us a perfect structural mirror for this exact brand of madness. Look at the Peloponnesian War. Specifically, the disastrous moment Athens hurled its forces into Sicily. The Athenians had the best military in the world, but they completely misjudged the true cost of actually wielding it. They had raw power projection, but zero ability to sustain it against an enemy that recognized their deep structural exhaustion. Athens didn't lose the Sicilian expedition because it was fundamentally weak. It lost because it applied the wrong kind of strength at the absolute worst possible time. That is the United States today. The American military, its navy, and its logistics network remain completely unmatched on the planet. But you cannot solve a complex economic equation with a kinetic strike. You absolutely cannot bomb a fluid global supply chain into submission when the market simply routes around your warships. You can't intimidate a rival superpower into surrender when their immediate response is to calmly sail their commercial cargo right through the very crosshairs you painted. The Strait of Hormuz has become a geopolitical mirror, and the reflection staring back at Washington should be deeply disturbing. Iran, a nation the U.S. president previously dismissed as having its military completely destroyed, seized control of the traffic and demanded a massive toll of over $1 million per vessel. And guess what? The ships paid up, not out of love for Tehran, but because the alternative of a permanently closed strait was infinitely worse, and rational actors follow structural market incentives, not White House demands. These million-dollar tolls were collected directly by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and according to Lloyd's List, they were paid in Chinese yuan, not U.S. dollars. We literally watched the petrodollar system being dismantled in real time at the world's biggest energy choke point, transacted in the exact currency of the country America thought it could easily bully. Beijing's ultimatum isn't some loud, chest-thumping declaration of war. They are far too strategically sophisticated for that. It is written quietly in the movement of tankers, the choice of currency denomination, and the joint veto they slammed down alongside Russia at the UN Security Council to kill a draft resolution on the strait. By refusing to treat Washington's pressure as legitimate, their message is final. The Strait of Hormuz is not America's private lake. Iranian crude is not America's to embargo. And China's economic lifeline is absolutely not a bargaining chip in someone else's war. The U.S. is now staring down a trap where no amount of firepower offers an easy way out. Escalate and risk World War III, or retreat and swallow the strategic humiliation of being openly defied without consequence. There is no magical third option that somehow preserves both American credibility and restraint. This is how global hegemony actually dies. Not overnight, but when the cost of maintaining the illusion of dominance finally outweighs the cost of simply accepting its end. The minute China had to choose between the economic bleeding of obeying a blockade and the reputational hit of defying it, Washington had already lost the board. Ultimately, no matter how many warships flowed in the Gulf, this blockade didn't break because a missile was fired. It broke because a single tanker sailed, the superpower that understands this distinction, will script the rest of the 21st century, while the one clinging to the past will simply become a cautionary footnote within it.